Let's get right into it, because there is a massive misconception out there about the Cambridge AS level Afrikaans speaking test, specifically paper 8679. A lot of students, and honestly even some instructors, treat this exam like it's just a casual conversation. You know, you walk into the room, you chat in Afrikaans for a bit, the examiner nods, and somehow a grade just magically pops out of a black box. Well, I was completely auditing the syllabus and the official examiner materials recently, and I have to tell you, that assumption is entirely busted. It is completely wrong. The speaking test is absolutely not just a test of how smoothly you can chat. When we rip open the hood and actually look at the content and presentation mark scheme, there is a hyper-specific, rigid methodology that examiners are listening for. They are tracking your cognitive steps in real time. So in this explainer, we are going to act as your personal exam auditors. We're going to demystify exactly what's inside that grading box, test these common assumptions against the actual rules, and completely rewire how you approach your speaking test.
Right. Look at this. It is often said that the difference between a B and an A star often comes down to how well you understand the mark scheme. I want you to let that sink in, because it's not just some motivational exaggeration, it is the literal, fundamental truth of the entire Cambridge assessment system. When you're sitting there, hitting the content and presentation criteria, your fluency in Afrikaans, your accent, your basic vocabulary, that alone simply isn't enough to secure the top band. The examiners are actually stress testing your cognitive processing. They are sitting there with the grid, waiting for you to demonstrate highly structured, logical skills, and here is the brutal reality. If we don't know exactly what those specific skills are, we literally cannot demonstrate them. We're just guessing. Our entire mission today is to arm you with that insider knowledge. We are going to turn the mark scheme from some secret, heavily guarded grading tool into your personal, bulletproof roadmap for success. Section 1. Core Concepts. Let's decode the assessment objectives.
Okay, the first major domain the examiners are targeting is knowledge and understanding. Now, if we audit the exact wording here, something really crucial stands out. It's the definition of knowledge. The biggest myth out there is that knowledge just means memorizing massive, endless lists of Afrikaans vocabulary or regurgitating standard pre-written responses. But Cambridge explicitly destroys that myth. They state that true mastery is exhibiting a connected, conceptual understanding that is transferable to unfamiliar contexts. What does that actually mean for you in the hot seat? It means when the examiner throws you a complete curveball question, something you never studied, they do not want to hear a panicked, rehearsed speech that barely fits the topic. They want to see if your brain can take abstract concepts and apply them to a completely new, unpredictable scenario. Live, right there on the spot. It requires a lot of mental agility, but passing that specific stress test is exactly what separates the top-tier candidates from the rest of the pack.
Moving up the difficulty ladder, we hit analysis. This is where we transition from just knowing facts to actively and visibly processing them for the examiner. Analysis is defined here as the systematic breakdown of information. It is entirely about using evidence-based reasoning and data interpretation. In the context of your Afrikaans speaking test, think about what happens when you're presented with a stimulus text or maybe a table of data. The natural amateur reflex is to just describe what you see. The text says this, the table shows that. But guess what? Mere description won't cut it. The mark scheme is rigged to reward candidates who extract the relevant data, interpret the logical relationships between those data points, and then actually draw evidence-based conclusions out loud. You literally have to show the examiner how the gears in your head are turning and how the pieces connect. And that naturally brings us to the absolute pinnacle of the mark scheme. Evaluation. This is the highest order cognitive objective. If you are aiming for that top score, this is the zone you have to operate in. Evaluation demands that you question assumptions, that you actively consider different perspectives, and, this is the kicker, that you justify your decisions with hard, undeniable evidence. A massive trap students fall into here is thinking that an evaluation is just sharing their personal opinion. I think this is good, I think this is bad. No, top-scoring candidates never just offer a baseline opinion. They evaluate the alternatives, they weigh competing approaches against each other, and they deliver highly justified recommendations. They say, in Afrikaans, based specifically on this piece of evidence, this route is the most logical conclusion. It's about proving to the examiner that you have a critical, independent, and highly analytical mind at work. Let's move to Section 2, Technical Methodology. We're going to unlock what we call the method mark strategy. So the obvious question now is, how on earth do we actually hit those intense cognitive domains in the middle of a high-pressure live speaking test? How do we definitively prove to the examiner that we are analyzing and evaluating? Well, we can actually use a rigid 6-step procedural framework to lock in marks for our systematic thinking, what we like to call method marks. Step 1. Deconstruct the question. Before you even open your mouth, figure out exactly what command word they are using. Step 2. Extract the relevant data from your stimulus materials. Step 3, select your analytical framework. Are you comparing? Are you contrasting? Step 4, execute your explanation clearly and logically. Step 5, verify your reasoning on the fly. Does what you just said actually make logical sense? And finally, step 6, present your findings using the correct, subject-specific terminology. If you internalize this step-by-step framework, you guarantee that your spoken answer is structurally bulletproof before it even leaves your brain. Now, perfectly tied into that strategy are presentation conventions. And I know what you're thinking, wait, presentation? This is a speaking test, not a poster board. But remember, the grading category is literally called content and presentation, and that second word carries serious weight. We are being heavily assessed on how we verbally package our information. You need to think of it like an invisible checklist you're giving the examiner. Structure your response with clear verbal headings, apply the correct terminology accurately, utilize appropriate conversational formats depending on the scenario you're given, and critically, ensure clear verbal annotation. That means using signposting words to guide the examiner through your thoughts, like saying firstly, however, or in conclusion in Afrikaans. The practical application of these strict formatting conventions is absolutely vital because it proves to Cambridge that you have developed professional, high-level communication skills, not just the ability to chat. Section 3, Critical Analysis. Let's look at mastering that all-important evaluation level. When auditing this specific part of the syllabus, I found a massive separator in the mark scheme that a lot of people totally miss: the strict distinction between a basic evaluation and true comparative analysis. A basic evaluation, which will only get you mid-tier marks, might just describe two different things sequentially. You talk about thing A, then you talk about thing B. But true comparative analysis, that's a whole different ballgame. That requires you to identify similarities and differences simultaneously. It absolutely demands that you use comparative connectives in Afrikaans to link your thoughts seamlessly. Every single point of comparison needs to be instantly backed up with solid evidence from the stimulus. And then, and this is where the big marks live, we have to draw definitive conclusions about their relative importance. It is a complete, unbreakable logical loop. You identify, you compare, you support, and you conclude. If you skip one of those steps, the structural physics of your answer just collapses. Which brings us to Section 4, Examiner Warnings. We're going to look at the top 3 pitfalls that crash a candidate's score. I spent hours digging through the official principal examiner reports from Cambridge, the actual documents where the graders complain about what went wrong, and the exact same 3 fatal mistakes pop up year after year. First, candidates' answers are often far too vague. Examiners demand specific, granular details. Throwing out sweeping generalities will earn you absolutely nothing on the grid. Second, students constantly neglect those format and presentation checks we just broke down. They start rambling in a panic instead of structurally signposting their arguments clearly. And third, this one is a huge score killer. They provide answers that are not specific to the given context. Listen, if your stimulus material is about a hyper-specific scenario occurring in South Africa, your entire answer must be deeply rooted in that exact context. You absolutely cannot just recite some pre-memorized, generic essay on a loosely related global topic. The examiners see right through that. Your response must be laser-focused and hyper-specific to the prompt sitting right in front of you. While combing through those reports, I also discovered this incredibly high-yield hack directly from the examiners themselves. It turns out candidates consistently lose marks because they confuse key terminology during their spoken responses. But there is a surprisingly simple way to prevent this and simultaneously prove absolute conceptual mastery to the person grading you. Always define your key terms before you use them in your extended responses. If your entire argument hinges on a specific concept, take 5 seconds to briefly define it in Afrikaans first. Setting that definition acts as a solid anchor for your argument, and it instantly secures those knowledge and understanding marks right out of the gate. Think of it as a verbal checkpoint. It stabilizes your thought process and guarantees that your entire response stays exactly on track. So, let's look at what we've accomplished. We've successfully decoded the hidden cognitive domains, we've mapped out the rigorous method mark strategy, and we've stress-tested the biggest pitfalls right out of the examiner reports. The mark scheme isn't some mystical black box anymore. It is a mechanical, structural toolkit that you now possess. But wrapping up this explainer brings up one final, really provocative thought that I want you to sit with. If the literal difference between a B and an A star ultimately comes down to how well you structure your logic, your evidence, and your analysis, rather than just the sheer size of your Afrikaans vocabulary, are we all spending way too much of our revision time just memorizing flashcards and nowhere near enough time practicing how to actually think under pressure? Take that question into your next practice session. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I'll see you in the next one.